it came to pass that the children of Israel asked the Lord, saying, who shall go up for us against the Canaanites first to fight against them? Just again to remind you about the organizing of the whole book, the introduction takes into the part of the 3 parts of the book of Judges. Now you can break it down into smaller parts, but to me, chapter 1 all the way up through chapter 3 and verse 6 is just kind of the first overall look. I call it a failure observed. You're going to see the pattern displayed kind of prevalent tonight. Then from chapter 3, verse 7, all the way to the end of chapter 16, it's the stories about the judges. And then the prevailing principle, which again has to do with the fact that every man did that which was right in his own eyes. And even the last book, or last chapter, last verse of the book kind of gives that same thing. And that's the prevailing principle. I'll remind you, too, that the book reveals something extremely important as far as the rule of government. God's chosen people begins, of course, with Abraham. Abraham, then Isaac, Jacob, and then into Moses, Joshua. And that's what we see the leaders are. And so you have the first part is really Israel is a patriarchy. And so they're ruled in that particular way. And then they go to a theocracy, which is through Moses and Joshua, and again into the judges. And then from there they pass on into a monarchy with Saul and David and Solomon, and then a host of other kings, most of whom did not do that which was right in the sight of God. But they are God's chosen people, and this is how God worked with them. And a lot of it, in fact, for this 300 years, they really didn't like it. And they wanted to be like other nations. That's why they desired a king. Whoever is governing usually was the one that settled the serious disputes between either tribes or individuals. It's the one who made the final decisions, the one who led them, whether an enemy needed to be defeated or simply to defend the family or the different tribes or the whole nation, and he led them in battle. But a transition was made, and that's what we're seeing with this particular book. And you have to even think when we got to Joshua, and then when we see Caleb, even in this book a little bit more, we have to remember that Joshua was the successor of Moses. And these are important because both Joshua and Caleb are the only men, basically, that were over 20 besides Moses. Well, even he didn't make it into the promised land, but he made it through that entire 40 years. But the rest of them were dying off. Joshua and Caleb were the only ones that were the older men. And then when Joshua, of course, was 110 years old, that's when he died. But just before he died, he charged Israel to make a choice. And most of us remember that verse, choose you this day whom you will serve. And when he did that, he had a rock. And he made a covenant with them. And that rock was their witness. And he took that stone to be a witness and between them and this particular event. And then you get a little bit of the character of Israel. And this is important too, to notice the variation, the real change. Because even though we know they failed to follow 100% of the time, because that's something that even distinguishes Caleb from the rest of the leaders and the rest of the people that were there. It says in Joshua, and I guess I'm going to go, and I have to remember that I messed with all of these slides a little bit. Here's all the judges that were there. And I was going to tell you, I don't know if I've got it coming after this or not, but in Joshua 24:3, it says, Israel served the Lord all the days of Joshua and all the days of the elders that outlived Joshua, and which had known all the works of the Lord that he had done for Israel. So under the legal system, the law and the legal system was instituted. But once Joshua dies, there's really no successor. That's what they're left without. In fact, when Moses, before he died, he made it a point that he instituted Joshua as the successor, as the leader, the anointed one. But no one was raised up to do that just yet. Then we see the judges that are here, the list of them. We also learned that they really failed to be obedient, and they failed to drive out the inhabitants of the land. And we'll see some of that even in chapter 1. But he also makes mention that he had done this that he might prove them, whether they will keep the way of the Lord to walk therein as their fathers did it or not. Therefore, it says in Judges 2:23, therefore the Lord left those nations without driving them out hastily, neither delivered he them into the hand of Joshua. Sadly, what you're going to see is that Israel learned to live with their enemy. And the enemy learned how to corrupt Israel. So here we have the list of judges that are there. Now this shows 12. Some will make it more, and I can tell you easily, I can go to 14, no problem. Because you have to think, and I'll mention this in a little bit. Well, let me give you this a little bit, because before we get, the word for judge is the word shaphat. And it's used some in 17 verses. There's 22 different times just in the book of Judges alone. And in the form of our English, it's where we will find the word judge, judges, or judged that many times in the book. And our example is taken from Judges 2:16. Nevertheless, the Lord raised up judges, or the shaphat, which delivered them out of the hand of those that spoiled them. The word carries with it the idea of governing, judging, punishing, vindicating. They decided the controversies, they executed judgment, they pronounced sentence. That's what the judge did. The shaphat also shows the cycle of Israel. And most of us are familiar with that cycle of how that they serve the Lord, then they fall into idolatry or sin, then they get enslaved to another nation. They start whining and crying about it. God raises up a judge to deliver them, and they are delivered, and they enjoy a certain amount of time of peace, but then they quit listening to the judge, and they fall right back into sin. Well, one of the things, too, that you have to understand, that the last of the judges is Samuel. Now, Samuel's not on that list, if you notice, but he is certainly a judge, and I gave to you, I think I did last week, that they had gathered together at Mizpah. This is an example of him being the judgment, drew water, poured it out before the Lord, and fasted on that day and said, we have sinned against the Lord. And Samuel judged the children of Israel at Mizpah. Well, that brings up the fact then, too, that who was in that place before Samuel? They had a very corrupt judge by the name of Eli. And Eli had his sons judging Israel, and they were very corrupt. So right there you've got two more judges in extension of that. And Samuel ended up trying to make his sons judges, but they were rejected, I think out of a fear too that might be the same thing that would happen, what happened with Eli. Eli's sons were very corrupt. But Samuel is the last judge, and he's very much a transitional person going from the theocracy, being ruled through the law and by an individual as God raised them up, to a monarchy. And God forewarned them about what it would be like to be under a monarchy. Just to give you a little bit, too, of a map, and you can see not much of it, but you can see, probably because it's too small, when I get down later, we'll see a little bit, where you'll see where the judges ruled from, or where they judged from, kind of the area, and where they were raised up from, and we'll see that. Now, the first chapter, as stated last week, is really, there's a lot of this other than the middle part. It's not necessarily chronological. So you can't look at Judges as beginning right here and then you have the Judges, because there's some of this stuff that's repeated way back in the book of Joshua. So there's some things that will follow along with that. When we look at this, now after the death of Joshua, it came to pass that the children of Israel asked the Lord, saying, who shall go up for us against the Canaanites first to fight against them? This death of Joshua is also recorded in the final verses of the book of Joshua in chapter 24, verses 29 and 30. Again, along with where it says that in verse 31 that Israel served the Lord all the days of Joshua. It's interesting that after the death of Joshua, the people now asked the Lord who would step up and be his successor. No, they just said, who's going to go fight the Canaanites? Who would go up and be their leader in fighting against this enemy? Now, God does not really replace Joshua, but he does raise up a man. He raises up Judah. And the Lord said, Judah shall go up. Behold, I have delivered the land into his hand. Now, I don't know about you, but that sounds like a promise of victory. Isn't it very clear? But do not lose sight of the fact that that doesn't really come to fruition. Partly it does, and it's because of their behavior. As this is recorded, you will find that they do fail to listen to the judge. They will forsake the Lord, and they will begin to follow after other gods. And that is really very central to understanding this book and making it applicable to our lives today. The point being that they failed to drive out the enemy completely. Okay. You cannot make a truce with the flesh. The New Testament teaches us that we have to mortify the deeds of the flesh. We have to mortify the flesh. You are to reckon yourselves to be dead indeed unto sin. Not partially. You don't give them a little bit of habitation. You know, we'll look at some of this together. And it creates a real problem. Now in verse 3, we see that they join together. Judah and Simeon does. Judah and Simeon, and by the way, I'm going to give you a list if we get there tonight of how many tribes, which are almost all the tribes are listed in this particular chapter. And they all have the same flaw. They all have the same fault. Judah said unto Simeon his brother, come up with me into my lot, that we may fight against the Canaanites. And I likewise will go with thee into thy lot. So Simeon went with him. So Simeon and Judah are the two tribes whose inheritance seem to be somewhat connected or mixed together. In fact, Judah was the much larger tribe. Simeon's inheritance was kind of within the borders of Judah. And you can read that in Joshua 19 and verse 1. Then let's go on to verse 4. And Judah went up, and the Lord delivered the Canaanites and the Perizzites into their hand, and they slew of them in Bezek 10,000 men. And they found Adonai-Bezek in Bezek. And they fought against him, and they slew the Canaanites and the Perizzites. But Adonai-Bezek fled, and they pursued after him and caught him and cut off his thumbs and his great toes. What an awful thing to do. But you know what? When you start looking at this, well, let's read a couple other verses here and see. And it says in Adonai-Bezek said, 70 kings, having their thumbs and great toes cut off, gathered their meat under my table, as I have done, so hath God requited me. And they brought him to Jerusalem, and there he died. They did the same thing that he did to all those other kings. Big toes. Well, you're going to be not functioning too well as far as walking. That's where a lot of your balance is. Your thumbs, well, you can imagine you're going to have a hard time grabbing anything. you're especially no longer going to be able to function with a weapon of any sort. You can't grab a sword. You're incapable of fighting after this. Verse 8, now the children of Judah had fought against Jerusalem and had taken it and smitten it with the edge of the sword and set the city on fire. Now you'll notice I have also some notes in here that you're going to see the same thing that happens in verse 21 of this chapter, but also it goes all the way back to Joshua chapter 15 and verse 63. And you'll see those notes. I may not make mention of them all the time, but you'll see this is why I tell you it's not always chronological, because you're going way back into Joshua to find where these things happen. So we're getting the general idea, the behavior, the mentality of the people of Israel. And it says, and afterward, verse 9, the children of Judah went down to fight against the Canaanites that dwelt in the mountain and in the south and in the valley. And we'll get a little bit more on that later. And then in verse 10, and Judah went against the Canaanites that dwelt in Hebron. Now the name of Hebron was Kirjatharba, and they slew Sheshaiah and Ahiman and Talmai. And just to give you a little bit, the city of Hebron was first taken by Joshua in chapter 10 of Joshua and verse 36. The reason why that's important, because these three names of these three men that were there are all notable because of they were part of the Anakims, or the giants, if you remember. Joshua 14:15, and you'll see them also in Numbers chapter 13 and verse 32. And if you remember, too, the giants that the 10 spies saw when they first spied out the land, and the giants are the ones that said, oh, we be grasshoppers in their sight. We can't go in there. Well, this is the very ones that they conquered now. So they could have conquered them back then. These are the ones, and what they saw turned the hearts of Israel cold and made them wander through the wilderness for 40 years. Verse 11, and from thence he went up against the inhabitants of Debir. And the name of Debir before was Kirjath-Sepher. The city of Debir was a city that is actually called the city of books. Some people will say it may have been a library. It may have been the holder of the official records, but that's translated the city of books. And what it is they just simply refused to submit, so they were conquered. They were given an opportunity to just simply submit, but Joshua conquered them. You can go back and read it. Joshua chapter 10, verse 38, chapter 15, verse 15, and verse 49. That's their original history. Then we read something interesting about Caleb. Verse 12, and Caleb said, he that smiteth Kirjath-Sepher and taketh it, to him will I give Achish my daughter to wife. And guess who steps up? Well, he's not yet, but he will be the first judge that's noted as a judge, Othniel. He is the son of Kenaz, Caleb's younger brother. He took it and gave him to Achish his daughter to wife. Now, Debir is about 11 miles from Hebron. It's also considered a great lot of pasture land, and also because of the city of books, some will consider it a center of some culture. I'll mention later, but I'll mention it now that it's interesting that you're talking about cousins marrying. It's what it is. His nephew does that and then asks for his daughter's hand. Verse 14, and it came to pass when she came to him that she moved him to ask of her father a field. And she lighted from off her ass, and Caleb said unto her, what wilt thou? And I got to click it. And she said unto him, give me a blessing, for thou hast given me a south land. Give me also springs of water. And Caleb gave her the upper springs and the nether springs. And the children of the Kenite, Moses' father-in-law, went up out of the city of palm trees with the children of Judah into the wilderness of Judah, which lieth in the south of Arad, and they went and dwelt among the people. And Judah went with Simeon his brother, and they slew the Canaanites that inhabited Zephath, and utterly destroyed it. Key words. It's the right thing to do. And the name of the city was called Hormah. And also Judah took Gaza with the coast thereof, and Askelon with the coast thereof, and Ekron with the coast thereof. Now we're going to run into a little problem. I call this a job halfway done, or an unfinished task. It's the main problem. In verse 19 you see it, and the Lord was with Judah, and he drave out the inhabitants on the mountain. But he could not drive out the inhabitants of the valley, because they had chariots of iron. Now, that's all we got. All the information you got. What really happened here? We do not know. Did the forces that they saw prohibit them from even trying? Did they fight and fail? Were they overcome? Or again, did they see them as their forefathers saw them, as an unconquerable force? We be grasshoppers in their sight. Problem is, Psalms 20 and verse 7 says, some trust in chariots and some in horses, but we will remember the name of the Lord our God. I think they forgot that. Not only did they forget that, but you remember I told you that God left some of them there to try them to see what they would do. There's a verse in Deuteronomy. It's not going to come up on your screen, but in chapter 20 of Deuteronomy, from verses 10 to 15, there that Israel, as they were traveling through and they encountered a city, they were to proclaim peace to that city. And if the city was peaceful, then they were to make them tributaries, or they basically taxed them, took some things from them, and they would be at peace. But if they would not do that, then they were supposed to go into that city and kill all of the males, take their wives and their children and all of their goods. But now when you get to the promised land, in Deuteronomy chapter 20, same one, verses 16 and 17, it says, but to the cities of the land that God gave them, they were to save none alive. They were to utterly destroy them. Now, again, they could not drive out the inhabitants of the valley. They could not. Doesn't say God could not. God can do anything. It doesn't matter if there's a force that's 5 times their size. Wouldn't matter if they had tanks. If God so decided that they were going to take it, they could. There was some sort of flaw in this particular situation. And there is a contrast between this verse and the next verse that we'll see. 2 verses, 2 battles. The could nots and the coulds. Some were driven out, but some they could not drive out or expel. The same word that they could not drive out the inhabitants of the land is the same word translated possess elsewhere, or translated inherit or heir here. They could not inherit the land. They could not possess the land. But now I want you to notice let me give you this one before too. It's not going to show up on your screen. I mentioned chapter 20 of Deuteronomy. Let me give you one verse that'll read it. Deuteronomy chapter 20 verse 1 says this, when thou goest out to battle against thine enemy, and seest horses and chariots and a people more than thou, do not be afraid of them, for the Lord thy God is with thee, which brought thee up out of the land of Egypt. So that ought to tell you something was wrong. I don't think there was anything wrong with God's power. I think there was something wrong with the faith of Judah. They failed to do. But let's get back to our text, verse 20, because I said, when you look at this, they could not. That's why I said you have the could nots, but now we have the coulds. And they gave Hebron, remember that's where the Anakims were, the giants, unto Caleb, as Moses said, and he expelled thence the 3 sons of Anak. Again, these are the giants of the land. Caleb expelled them. Well, what's the difference between the 2 different foes? Whether it's giants or chariots, listen, it doesn't matter. Whatever the enemy is, they can be conquered. The difference is not in the enemy. The difference is in the Israelite facing the enemy. One trusted and obeyed God, and the other did not. Verse 21, and the children of Benjamin, here we go, did not drive out the Jebusites that inhabited Jerusalem. But the Jebusites dwell with the children of Benjamin in Jerusalem unto this day. You know, back when you look at Judah, they were promised victory. And I said, didn't it sound like they were promised victory? They were. But they did not get a complete victory because fear disrupted their faith. One had deficient power because they had a deficient faith. The other did not. What else do we read when we go a little bit further? Verses 22, 23, when we get to this again. Verse 22, in the house of Joseph. Now that's the tribe of Joseph. And Joseph's tribe, of course, is going to be split into 2. You'll see that a little bit later because of the fact that the Levitical tribe was not going to be an inheritance. They were going to have different spots within. So the tribe of Joseph, or the house of Joseph, they also went up against Bethel, and the Lord was with them. And the house of Joseph sent to descry Bethel. Now the name of the city was before was Luz. What does that mean? They sent to descry. That's to spy out. Jacob, of course, is the one who renamed Luz Bethel. He didn't actually camp in the city. He camped outside of it, and he renamed it Bethel, which is the house of God. That happens in Genesis 28:19. And Jehovah even said that he was the God of Bethel to Jacob, which is in the land of Canaan. So Joseph's tribe, again, is the one, though, that went in to help. And they sent out spies to plan for an attack. And so what do we read in verse 24? And the spies saw a man come forth out of the city, and they said unto him, show us, we pray thee, the entrance into the city, and we will show thee mercy. Isn't it interesting? They saw him come out. They're asking him to point out the entrance. See, you got to kind of figure they're not asking, well, we just saw him come out. We know how to get in. They're not asking for the normal way in. They're asking for a secret way in. They're asking for a way to sneak themselves in, because they are pretty much telling him, if you don't, we're going to kill you. That's basically what it is. They show us a secret entrance. The way an opposing force, in other words, could enter in secretly and attack, and if not, you're going to die. And verse 25, and when he showed them the entrance into the city, they smote the city with the edge of the sword, but they let go the man and all of his family. So he collected all of his goods, he collected his family, and they kept his word. Their word, verse 26 says, and the man went into the land of the Hittites and built a city and called the name thereof Luz, which is the name thereof unto this day. Now, before I go too much further, I want to give you a little bit, because you start looking at all the names, all the places, and you got to think of every city name, and I didn't actually name every city But I did start beginning to put names of the characters in chapter 1 up to this point, and we'll get, because it goes down to verse 36, you'll see a little bit more. And in this, you're going to find 38 names of either individuals or inhabitants of a city. Chapters 2 and 3, you're going to find additional ones, and it's going to equal about 53 different people or cities that they had to fight with. And so I'm going to throw up a list of who's who up here, and you're going to find all of their names. There may be, again, some that are not listed exactly as they are in the scriptures, because just like when the 3 Anakims that are right there, they're listed by name, and because of the space and size, I just said the 3 Anakims that are here to give you a name. But you can look and begin to see, like Bethel, well, the man that follows that afterwards up here, that's the man that the spies. You also see, I think, that the spies are mentioned here. These are not necessarily in order, and some of them, too, are not necessarily named, but their name is implied. Moses is named in here, but though we know he's not alive, and Jethro is the same. He's not alive, but he's also not even named, but we find his son being named in there. And we'll find a little bit. The Adonai Bezek, we know he was the king of Bezek. The city of Jerusalem, we know, was inhabited by the Jebusites. The city of Hebron was first developed and lived in by the giants. That's the names of Sheshai, Ahiman, and Talmai. All were notable, again, for being of the Anakims. And then you even have the Lord, Jehovah, that's in this list. You have Judah. And in fact, not only is Judah listed, but all the other tribes are listed besides Levi. Simeon, you have the city of Debir, you have Caleb, you have Achish, which is his daughter, Othniel, which is his nephew, Kenaz. That was Caleb's younger brother. The Kenites, and this is where you find Moses and Jethro, kind of implied. This is the family of Hobab, which was Jethro's son. You also have, and I think, multiple cities. So that's why I said there's more than 53 in this, because there are multiples cities that are mentioned. Inhabitants, for instance, of Gaza, Zephath, Askelon, Ekron, inhabitants in the mountains, inhabitants of the valleys. You've then got the tribe of Benjamin, the Jebusites, the house of Joseph, Bethel, the man of Bethel, the Hittites. This is mentioned because of the man who showed them the way to capture the city. He built another city of the same name in Luz. And if you go beyond that, you're going to find where we don't have time to get into it tonight, but Manasseh, Ephraim, Zebulun, Asher, Naphtali, and Dan. And all of them failed to drive out the inhabitants of the land. They failed. In fact, Dan is mentioned that that's the tribe that was forced by the Ammonites to live in the mountains rather than in the valleys. They said, no, we're not going to let you have that prime land. We're going to have this down here. Let me give you just the one more verse, at least in verse 27. We'll quit there. Neither did Manasseh drive out the inhabitants of Bethshan, that I never mentioned, and her towns, nor Tanakh and her towns, nor the inhabitants of Dor and her towns. So you see multiple cities, multiple towns, nor the inhabitants of Ibleam and her towns, nor the inhabitants of Megiddo and her towns, but the Canaanites would dwell in that land. It's the same story for everyone. And it came to pass when Israel was strong that they put the Canaanites to tribute, but they did not utterly drive them out. Now, why did they do that? Was it because they saw financial benefit to letting them stay? You know, it's such a struggle to fight. The spiritual application might be that we let certain desires, instead of crucifying them with Christ, we let them live with us because they bring pleasure to us. We get some benefit from it. Benefit that we enjoy. Well, they were enjoying a tribute or taxes that benefited them. But we're going to stop there and wait until next week to finish up the rest of the chapter, and then go a little bit further than that and before we get to chapter 2. But almost